Ilara stood on the dusty platform, the midday sun beating down, making her already worn dress cling uncomfortably. She wasn't meant to be here. Not truly. Her heart, a small, bruised thing, hammered against her ribs. Reverend Davies, portly and red-faced, cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the gathered men, then landing on her with a mixture of pity and barely concealed disdain. "Our next bride for the taking," he announced, his voice booming across the small Texas town square. Ilara felt the shame wash over her, a familiar tide she'd learned to swim against. Her father, a man whose kindness had evaporated with her mother's last breath, had sent her here. He'd promised her to the first man who'd offer enough for her passage, for the sake of her younger siblings, for the sake of their empty larder. It wasn't quite a sale, not in coin, but it felt worse. A public auction of her future. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. His name was Silas. He was the first to speak, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I'll take the short one," he said, and Ilara flinched. The other women, taller, fairer, shifted, relief clear on their faces. Silas didn't look at her. Not truly. He looked at the Reverend, then at the dirt. Ilara felt the sting of his words, of her inadequacy, of being chosen for her smallness rather than despite it. She was just another burden her father had finally shed. Her feet ached, rooted to the spot. She didn't look back at the train, though she longed for its escape, for any escape. This was her new reality, chosen sight unseen, by a stranger who only noted her height. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And subscribe if you want more content like this one. Your engagement helps us share more stories of quiet resilience and unexpected belonging. Silas approached her, his shadow falling over her small frame. He wasn't smiling. His face was weathered, like the plains themselves, etched with lines Ilara couldn't read. He held out a hand, calloused and strong. "Ma'am," he said, the single word a question. It wasn't a demand, not an order. It was an invitation, however hesitant. A tiny flicker of uncertainty sparked within her, a new feeling amidst the shame. She had expected to be told, commanded, not asked. This journey was just beginning. Ilara's childhood had been a lesson in scarcity. Not just of food, though there was plenty of that too, but of warmth, of gentle words. Her mother, gone too soon, had been the sun in their small home. But after she passed, a long, cold shadow fell. Her father, once a jovial man with laughter that filled the house, became a hollow shell. He drank, and the kindness in his eyes curdled into resentment. Ilara, the eldest girl, bore the brunt of his bitterness, her small shoulders weighed down by a burden too heavy for a child. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended to her younger siblings, quiet and efficient, learning early that silence was a shield. Her own dreams, once bright and airy as prairie clouds, faded into the endless gray of their daily struggle. She had learned what it felt like to be unwanted, a feeling that settled deep in her bones like the chill of a perpetual winter. Neighbors would whisper, their pity thin and sharp, dissecting her family's decline like a grim autopsy. Her father, blinded by his sorrow and drink, didn't notice, or didn't care. The decision to send her west, to marry a stranger, wasn't an act of cruelty in his mind, but of desperation. He saw it as a choice for her survival, and perhaps for the survival of the others. Ilara saw it as an abandonment, the final severance of any thread connecting her to a semblance of home. The shame of it clung to her, a sticky shroud. She carried scars, not visible ones, but deep emotional wounds that bled silently. They made her wary, cautious, a small creature ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. Trust was a foreign concept, something for others who hadn't known constant disappointment. She had built walls around herself, brick by careful brick, designed to keep out the pain that seemed to follow her like a shadow. Even as Silas extended his hand, a part of her wondered what hidden cost came with such a gesture. Nothing was truly given without expectation. She had learned that harsh truth over and over. Her heart whispered doubts, questions she dared not voice. Would this new life be just another variation of the old one? Would she trade one form of burden for another? The vast, open plains of Texas seemed to mock her smallness, her insignificance. Yet, beneath the layers of resignation, a faint, almost imperceptible spark of hope flickered. It was a defiant thing, refusing to be extinguished entirely, even after everything. Silas led her from the station, not speaking, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't rush her, letting her set her own slow pace, a small mercy Ilara hadn't expected. He walked beside her, a solid, silent presence. He smelled of dust and horses and something clean, like fresh-cut timber. They passed the mercantile, where a few women lingered, their eyes sharp as needles, pricking at Ilara's sense of exposure. She lowered her gaze, familiar with the weight of judgment. Silas, however, didn't acknowledge them, his focus seemingly on the road ahead. His indifference felt like a strange form of protection. The ranch was a quiet place, nestled against a stand of ancient live oaks that seemed to watch over it with knowing eyes. The house was small but sturdy, built of rough-hewn timber, smelling of wood smoke and old leather. Inside, it was spare, clean, and surprisingly orderly for a bachelor's home. A single room, a bed, a small table, a stone fireplace. No frills, no fuss, just necessity. It mirrored Silas himself. He pointed to a small cot in the corner. "You can sleep there," he said, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. He didn't touch her, didn't try to usher her. He simply offered the space. Ilara noticed the small details. A neat stack of worn books beside the fireplace, a well-oiled rifle hanging above the mantel, a faded photograph of a woman and a young boy on the table, their faces smiling, their eyes holding a sadness that Ilara recognized. He saw her looking at it. "My wife," he said, his voice flat. "And our son, gone these past 5 years." He didn't elaborate, didn't offer a story, but the simple statement explained much of his quiet grief, his solitary existence. He didn't look at her when he spoke, but out the window, at the vast, empty sky. The unspoken weight of his loss hung in the air, a silent testament to a life upended. Ilara understood loss too, its sharp edges and the way it reshaped everything. Perhaps this was the nature of their connection, a shared understanding of deep-seated pain. He didn't ask her about her own past, didn't pry. He simply let her be, allowing her to process this new, uncertain reality. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but a quiet space, waiting to be filled. It was a fragile beginning. Days folded into weeks, marked by the rhythm of the ranch. Silas worked from sunup to sundown, and Ilara found herself falling into a routine too. She kept the small house clean, cooked the simple meals, and tended a small patch of struggling garden. He never asked her to. She simply did, because idleness felt like a sin, and perhaps because she wanted to prove her worth, even to herself. He left her alone, giving her space she hadn't known she craved. It was a freedom of sorts, not the boisterous, expansive kind, but a quiet liberation from constant scrutiny. He never raised his voice. He never made demands. His presence was like the steady, unwavering prairie wind, constant but gentle. One evening, after a long day, Ilara stumbled, twisting her ankle on a loose stone near the well. A sharp cry escaped her lips. Silas, who had been some distance away, was at her side in an instant, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he helped her up. He didn't chide her carelessness. He just looked at her ankle, his brow furrowed with concern. "Best get you inside," he murmured, his voice low, almost a rumble. He carried her back to the house, his arms strong and steady around her. The sheer kindness of the gesture, so unexpected, brought a prickle to her eyes. Later, as he cleaned and bandaged her ankle with quiet efficiency, Ilara watched him. His hands were calloused, roughened by work, yet they moved with a careful tenderness. "You don't have to stay, you know," he said, not looking at her, but at her injured foot. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "If this ain't what you bargained for, you can leave. I'd give you passage back." The words hung in the air, an offer of choice, something she had never truly had. It wasn't a trick. She could see the earnestness in his gaze when he finally met her eyes. This offer of choice, this unexpected gift of safety, began to chip away at the walls she had built. The shame that had been her constant companion began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of something else, not yet belonging, but a flicker of trust. She realized she wasn't just another burden to him. She was, in some strange, quiet way, seen. His kindness was a balm, slowly, gently, beginning to heal some of the deeper, unseen scars. She knew then that she wouldn't leave. The quiet peace of the ranch began to ripple. The town, small and insular, was not accustomed to strangers, especially not a young woman who arrived without family or clear purpose. Whispers started. At the general store, the women would fall silent when Alara entered, their eyes darting, then dropping. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife, a stern woman with a reputation for sharp observations, cornered Silas one afternoon. Alara saw her gesticulating wildly, her face a mask of disapproval. Later, Silas returned, his jaw tight. He said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. The whispers grew louder, fueled by Mrs. Abernathy's righteous indignation. She's not a proper wife. Alara overheard one woman say, he bought her, plain and simple. It ain't right, not before God. The implied accusation that Alara was less than respectable stung worse than any physical blow. She felt the weight of public shaming, a familiar heavy cloak. It was the same judgment her family had faced, merely redirected. The town saw her desperation as a weakness, her unconventional arrival as a moral failing. They couldn't understand the quiet kindness of Silas, only the perceived impropriety. One Sunday, Reverend Davies, the same man who had introduced her on the platform, preached a sermon on the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of unholy arrangements. His eyes, during the sermon, seemed to flicker towards Alara, sitting quietly beside Silas. She felt a cold dread creep into her heart. The community's disapproval was a growing storm, threatening to break over their fragile peace. She felt the old urge to flee, to disappear, to outrun the judging stares, but something held her back this time. Silas noticed her discomfort, though she tried to hide it. He placed a hand over hers, a rare, comforting gesture. His touch was firm, grounding. He didn't speak, but his presence was a quiet defiance against the rising tide of gossip. Alara wondered if he felt the burden of her presence, the way she complicated his already solitary life. The choice to stay or leave felt sharper than ever. If she stayed, she might drag him deeper into the town's disfavor. But if she left, she would lose the only true glimpse of belonging she had ever known. The storm broke one afternoon when Sheriff Brody, a man known more for his rigid adherence to rules than for his understanding, rode up to the ranch. His face was grim, his eyes narrowed. Silas, he said without preamble, I've been hearing talk about arrangements, about a woman living here without the proper papers. Folks are saying you've taken advantage. Alara felt her blood run cold. This was it, the inevitable consequence of their quiet, unconventional life. She wanted to shrink away, to become invisible. Silas, however, stood tall, his gaze unwavering. She's here by her own free will, Sheriff, he stated, his voice calm even. She chose to come. We got a preacher's word on it. Brody scoffed. A preacher's word ain't a marriage certificate, Silas. Folks are saying she's a shame to the community, a stain on decent folk. Alara felt the heat of embarrassment rise in her cheeks. The words felt like physical blows. Her desperation had been mistaken for weakness, her vulnerability twisted into something ugly. She ain't no shame, Silas countered, his voice hardening, a rare edge to it. She's a good woman, and she ain't done nothing wrong. He stepped slightly in front of Alara, shielding her from the sheriff's condemning gaze. It was a small movement, but it spoke volumes of his loyalty, his quiet determination to protect her. Alara felt a surge of emotion, a wave of fierce gratitude. He wasn't abandoning her, he was standing with her, against the tide. The sheriff lingered, his eyes assessing, but Silas didn't back down. After a tense silence, Brody finally sighed. Get your affairs in order, Silas. I ain't saying what I'll do, but folks are watching, and the church ain't happy. He rode off, leaving behind a lingering sense of threat. Alara looked up at Silas, her heart full. You didn't have to, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He simply shook his head. Ain't nobody gonna shame you here, Alara. Not while I draw breath. His words, plain and unwavering, affirmed a connection that transcended their unconventional beginning. That evening, the air was heavy, not just with the unspoken threat of the sheriff's return, but with a new intimacy that had been forged in the confrontation. Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel against stone the only sound. Alara, watching him, felt a need to break the silence, to share a burden she had carried alone for too long. "My mother, she died when I was small," Alara began, her voice barely a whisper. "My father, he never recovered. He said I was too much like her, too weak. He sent me away, said I was a burden." The words, once so impossible to speak, tumbled out, raw and painful. Silas stopped sharpening, his gaze fixed on the fire. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply listened, his silence a comforting presence. "My wife, Sarah," he said, after a long pause, his voice rough with remembered grief. "She was strong, but the fever, it took her quick. Our boy, Thomas, he withered away soon after, like a sapling in a drought." He finally looked at her, his eyes holding a profound, ancient sadness. "I saw myself in you, Alara. That same lost look, that same quiet way of carrying too much." He picked up the faded photograph from the table, his thumb tracing the edges. "I never really thought I'd smile again. Never thought I'd have company." Not real company. He didn't say wife. Didn't say family. He said company. And in his quiet, understated way, it meant more. It meant shared space, shared quiet, shared sorrow. Alara realized then that his offer of choice, his unexpected kindness, wasn't just charity. It was a reflection of his own desperate need for connection, for someone to witness his own grief. "Are we always going to be just company?" Alara asked, the question hanging in the air, a reflection of her deepest anxieties, her longing for something more concrete, something beyond the unspoken. She felt vulnerable, exposed. Silas finally met her gaze, his eyes dark in the firelight. "That, Alara," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "is a choice we both get to make. Ain't no one forcing either of us." The weight of her own agency settled upon her, heavy but strangely empowering. The question of their future hung between them, a quiet promise, or perhaps a fragile hope. Alara thought of the cold, unfeeling house of her childhood, the one where laughter had died and silence had become a shroud. She thought of Silas's ranch, spare but filled with the dignity of honest labor and the quiet comfort of his presence. Here, she was not a burden. Here, she was seen. Her smallness not a flaw but a simple fact. His protection, his unwavering support against the town's judgment, had been a revelation. It wasn't about marriage papers, not really. It was about trust, about choosing to stand by someone. One blustery morning, Silas found her in the small garden patch, attempting to coax life from the dry soil. She looked up, her face smudged with dirt, a hopeful but tired expression in her eyes. "There's a circuit preacher coming through next month," he said, his voice low, steady. "We could make it proper, if you wanted." It wasn't a proposal, not in the way stories described it. It was an offer, again, of choice, of an affirmation that was more profound than any grand declaration. It was about making their unspoken connection visible, about giving it a name the world understood. Alara felt a strange lightness in her chest. The word proper usually filled her with dread, hinting at rules and expectations she could never meet. But coming from Silas, it felt like a shield, a protection against the whispers, a claim to a life she was slowly, tentatively building. She looked around the small ranch, at the weathered wood of the house, at the steady silhouette of Silas against the vast sky. This wasn't just a place. It was becoming home, a place where her scars were not hidden but simply part of her story, accepted without judgment. "I want to," she said, her voice clear, stronger than she had expected. "I want to stay." It was a quiet win, a choice born not of desperation, but of a slowly blooming belonging. It meant sacrificing the notion of a grand, romantic escape, but gaining something far more precious, the steady, unwavering safety of a man who saw past her perceived flaws, who offered a haven in a world that had only ever offered burdens. She was not broken here. She was simply Alara, finding her way. The day of the circuit preacher's arrival was overcast, a somber sky mirroring the town's mood. Mrs. Abernathy and her ilk stood outside the small church, arms crossed, their expressions disapproving. Elara felt a tremor of fear, but then Silas took her hand, his grip firm, a silent reassurance. They walked in together, not looking at anyone, their focus solely on each other. The church was hushed, the tension thick as dust in the air. Reverend Davies, looking uncomfortable, stood at the altar. The preacher, a traveling man with kind eyes and a weathered Bible, began the simple ceremony. He spoke not of grand pronouncements, but of two souls choosing each other, of finding strength in shared burdens. His words were plain-spoken, devoid of judgment. As Elara looked at Silas, standing beside her, she saw not a man who had bought her, but a man who had chosen her, who had offered her shelter and respect when no one else would. She felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a quiet triumph that no disapproving gaze could diminish. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, a heavy silence descended. Mrs. Abernathy shifted, a flicker of outrage in her eyes, but she said nothing. The collective gaze of the town rested on Elara, waiting. She met their stares, no longer shrinking from them. She was no longer just the short one or the burden. She was Elara, and she was choosing to stay. The moment passed, the quiet defiance of their bond holding firm against the weight of community judgment. It was not a battle won with shouts, but with unwavering presence. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, his voice gentle. Outside, the town still watched, their opinions likely unchanged, but it didn't matter. The quiet resolve of Silas, his steady hand in hers, was all that mattered. They walked out of the church, not to cheers, but to a silence that spoke volumes. It was not a heroic triumph, but a quiet victory of choice and belonging over condemnation. They had chosen each other, and in that choice, found their true foundation. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm, deeper and more resonant than before. The seasons turned, painting the prairie in hues of green and gold. Then, winter's stark beauty. Elara learned to ride, to mend fences, to read the unspoken language of the land. She found a quiet joy in watching the young saplings Silas planted grow, their roots taking hold, just as her own had. The scars of her past remained, etched into her memory, but they no longer defined her. They were part of her story, a testament to what she had overcome, illuminated now by the kindness she had found. Silas remained a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He would leave small wildflowers on her pillow, or make sure her favorite stew was simmering after a long day. He never stopped offering her choice, even in the smallest things, a silent acknowledgement of her journey from helplessness to agency. Their love wasn't a roaring fire, but a steady, warm hearth, burning low and true. It was a love built on shared silence, on mutual respect, and on the quiet understanding of burdens carried and gently laid down. Sometimes, Elara would catch him looking at the faded photograph of Sarah and Thomas. A pang of bittersweet sorrow would ripple through her, a reminder of the shadows that still lingered for him. She knew she could never replace what he had lost, but she could stand beside him, a new tree planted in the same soil, offering new shade. Their happiness was not without its tinges of sadness, a silent acknowledgement of the lives that had brought them to this quiet, unexpected haven. The town's whispers never entirely faded, but their sharpness dulled. Elara and Silas were no longer just a curiosity. They were a quiet fixture, two figures against the vast open sky, building a life brick by painstaking brick. There was no grand triumph, no sudden wealth, no miraculous disappearance of hardship. There was only the quiet, enduring work of two souls finding safety and belonging in each other, under the watchful, ancient trees. It was a hard-won peace, a hauntingly hopeful testament to the healing power of unwavering human connection, a bond forged in dust and quiet courage, proving that even the most broken things could become whole again.